Also, for those of you in the room, please turn on your mics at the table when you have a question. Make sure you speak into those mics as well. Now I'll turn it over to Governor Daugaard.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for gathering here and those on the line for this press conference. I missed being with you last week because I was at the National Governors Association, and I thought I would open by just making a few comments about that. Those meetings are very heavily scheduled, and I'm not going to go into all the items that we had. There's presentations on education, on healthcare, on transportation, on workforce, economic development, technology and innovation. Around those meetings, or as an alternative to attending one of those meetings, I sometimes had and took advantage of opportunities to visit with some of the cabinet secretaries who made themselves available. So I had a meeting with Ryan Zinke, the Secretary of the Interior, about their efforts to reorganize that department and all the bureaus within it, try to unify the various regions that each of their respective bureaus have. They don't have a commonality of borders, and that presents some bureaucracy that causes delays and makes management less efficient, and so he's looking to unify those borders of the various regions. So, for example, the border for the Bureau of Land Management regions would mirror the borders that, say, the Park Service might have. And so if you go to visit the regional director in, I'll make it up, Denver, for one bureau, you could also visit the regional director for that bureau in the same building or in the same city at least. So that makes sense to me, and I was generally supportive of that. I also raised with him a project that we've been working on for at least 5 years, and that is funding for a link of the Mickelson Bike Trail to Mount Rushmore, and that we're hoping to make some progress this year on that, on an alternative route. The original routes were not seen supported, so we've identified an alternative route and hope that we can make some progress on that, and he expressed a willingness to support me in that regard. So after 5 years, maybe we'll see some progress. We'll see. I also met with the relatively new Health and Human Services Secretary, Alex Azar. I think he's just been in office for slightly over a month now. Coincidentally, he had visited South Dakota when he worked for Eli Lilly. They had a subsidiary that we were trying to attract to South Dakota as a business location for them, and so he came to the pheasant hunt one year, and I have a picture of himself and me because we were on the same team shooting pheasants together, and so I reminded him of that, and then we moved on to topics including our efforts to combat opioid use and abuse in South Dakota, our efforts to improve federal funding for Indian Health Service patients who are also Medicaid patients, and also the planned waiver we're going to be filing to have a work requirement attached to a few of our Medicaid recipients. And so we had a very good conversation. It reminded me also, too, that a commitment to serve at those levels of the federal government is a very large commitment. Seema Verma, who's the head of CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, she was also there. She came from Indiana. Her husband and high school age student still is in Indiana. And so she comes to DC during the week and goes home for just weekends, and here was a weekend where she didn't even get to do that. She stayed in DC to meet with people like me. So I appreciate the commitment they give. I was also part of the leadership of a panel on workforce development, and that's been a focus of mine as WGA chair as well. So those are just a little bit about the National Governors Association meeting, and I'd be happy to answer questions about that or anything else you'd like to talk about.
Governor, the House voted down your proposal to enter into an interstate compact on licensure. Do you have any thoughts about that? Where do you go from here?
Well, I'm certainly disappointed about that. I do think there's an inclination on the part of states to go beyond protecting our citizens. The idea of a license is it's a mark that someone is qualified and has been vetted in some fashion and now is worthy of conducting business, and the citizens can trust that they're capable. And yet there's tremendous variation, I should say, among the states, which licenses are required and what occupations require no license. If you look at other countries, it was interesting to me, The Economist here just a couple of weeks ago had 2 articles on the proliferation of licenses in the United States as compared to other developed countries, and how that is a burden on our economy and a obstacle to movement among the states. And that's the way I view it. And I certainly think our effort to give a nod to the other states that surround us as being equally able to judge the qualifications of people in these industries. And I think our idea of accepting that if North Dakota licenses a landscape architect, then they can come to South Dakota and get an 18-month temporary permit to place bushes and such without me being in great danger. And so I worry that our associations, whose job are to look out for their own profession, were the only opponents to this legislation. And if you look at the opponents in the committee, it was all the associated engineers and different associations of professions fighting to protect their own members. And I'm just sorry that they were effective in convincing our legislators that this was a threat to the citizens, when in fact I think it was neither a threat to the citizens nor really a threat to their own members either, albeit being portrayed that way.
Governor, the Senate Appropriations Committee just approved House Bill 1162. That's the bill that's tacked on to the Marcy's Law changes. It's a $200,000 appropriation and some of the different changes that need to be made for the AG and the Secretary of State to put on the June migrant ballot. Is that something you're going to sign?
Yes, I think that I do. I was very pleased to see the sponsors of the original Marcy's Law initiated constitutional amendment and Representative Mickelson and others who were supporting changes to the constitutional unintended consequences, the cost to counties, the inability to share information, the fact that people were labeled victims, whether they chose to be considered as victims or not. The changes would allow victims to opt in, say, yeah, I consider myself a victim and I want this information withheld from the public, or I want my rights protected. But if I'm in a car accident and the question is who's the victim, well, maybe that's not what Marcy's Law was intended to protect against. So I do think it's very good of the two parties to come together and find common ground so the victims' rights are protected, and yet these unintended consequences are corrected and avoided. And whether that choice of the voters to adopt this approach is considered in November or June is I think neither here nor there to me. But I can understand why the proponents of the change might like it on the June ballot, because as you've heard me complain in the past, the ballot is increasingly burdened by multiple initiated laws and constitutional amendments, and it's difficult for the voters to become informed about a multitude of issues and not to, and in some cases it can be difficult to remember which one is this and which one's that, and if there's just one on the June ballot, it'll be simpler for proponents and opponents. I don't know that there'd be any opponents, but for proponents to say, here's what it does, please vote yes, and here's why. So I think it's good that it might be on the June ballot, and I understand there's some costs associated with that, with printing a nonpartisan ballot, because in June typically there's two partisan ballots, the Republican primary ballot and the Democrat primary ballot. So you need a third nonpartisan ballot.
So you would sign it?
I would sign the bill, yeah. I guess I could have just said yes, couldn't I?
I think Democrats and some others in the Senate expressed concern about precedent that moving this vote to a primary would set. But supporters of the idea say there would be a cost saving with it. Do you think that's is worth the cost savings to potentially start this precedent?
Well, certainly one could argue that it's a precedent. I think, as I understand it, it was only recognized that these costs must be borne by the state and reimbursed to the counties, the cost of the ballot. It was only realized after the voting committee and maybe even on the floor. I think it was only at the last minute. But I do understand the argument that, well, the states or the counties will have to incur more costs. They're also going to save more costs as well. That makes sense to me. So I think it's a good placement on the June ballot. I think it's worthy of being there, and I can understand how it isolates it from the other issues that might be found on the November ballot. So again, easier for the voters to manage these multiple issues if they're divided up a little bit.
Governor, there are two bills, Senate Bill 214 and House Bill 1311, that deal with raising legislator pay. Those would both take effect in 2019 as they're written now. Do you have any advice to appropriators if either of those bills is approved, where they might be able to find that money at least for the first year if it's not written into your budget, obviously?
Right. Well, happily, the fiscal year 19 picture has brightened, as you all know from the revenue estimates that were adopted 2 weeks ago. And so there is, within the legislature's purview, $18 million, I can't recall now off the top of my head, more to spend in 19 that I didn't identify a home for in my December proposal. So they're able to spend it on education or Hope State salaries for some of our workers here. And certainly within those dollars, they could easily accommodate additional legislator pay for the next group of legislators. Some of them would be voting on a pay that would affect them if they get reelected. Others are not reelectable, so they're voting for the next legislator group. So I think there's plenty of money there to spend on multitude of things, and this could be among them.
Turn it over to the phones right now, if there's anyone on the phones with a question. All right, we'll turn it back to the room.
I think there's a bill that's cleared both chambers that would put some legislative findings in the state statute. It's my understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong, that usually legislative findings don't really go in the state statute. Do you think that's appropriate?
Yes, that is unusual. There certainly have been other instances where state findings were made part of a bill, and I understand the bill you're talking about was the bill that dealt with abortion providers, and I think the intent of the sponsor was to call attention to the way in which prior legislation had been carried out, or with maybe been carried out by Planned Parenthood in a way that I think was, in the minds of the legislature, not in keeping with the intent of the legislature to convey information in a neutral fashion. And so I'm inclined to sign that bill. I haven't signed it yet, and I'll certainly reread it again, but I can understand why the bill was written in the way it was, in the way it was written. But again, it is unusual to include legislative findings as part of a bill. It has been done in the past, but not very often.
I know there were some free speech concerns regarding that bill. Could you possibly address what I guess critics of the legislation have called possible free speech?
I think the statute required certain statements of information be provided to patients who are considering an abortion, and the way Planned Parenthood had decided to convey those statements was with a preface: politicians have required us to tell you this, or politicians have required us to tell you that. And again, I think that by conveying the information in that way leads a patient to believe that it's not valued and not valuable. And I can understand why the legislature would be, those who supported the legislation that required that information be delivered, be offended by that and react to that.
Governor, can I ask your thoughts on the matter between Representative DeSanto and Peterson, how you first became aware of that, and Johnson, and thoughts on that?
I can't recall how I first became aware of it. That all occurred while I was at National Governors Association, so it was a little bit in the background because, again, as I said, the NGA meeting is just scheduled back to back to back. We were, for example, Sunday morning, we met at 7 a.m. Eastern Time, which is 6 a.m. Central Time, and my body was saying, yes, it is 6 a.m. Central Time, Dennis, and you were up with the governor of Michigan till an hour you shouldn't have been the night before. So I was aware of it. My attitude is the legislature is responsible for the policing of its members, and I don't have anything to do with that. It's really up to them, and I don't know that I can contribute anything. That people can't judge for themselves. I understand the video's now available, and so people can look at that for themselves and draw their own conclusions.
Governor, we talked about some of the ballot question changes that have been circulating in your committees across the bills. I wanted to ask about 1177 that would require circulators on their petition form to have their name, email address, and phone number. 1186, which would require filing with the Secretary of State to know details of where you live or in your means and tuition. And I was curious if you have any thoughts on those bills at this time.
I do think it's worthwhile to try to elicit some additional information from circulators who I think it's plain in some cases have been from out of state, even though the law clearly requires an in-state resident to be a circulator. I've heard an audio tape of someone saying, "I'm from Colorado," in their own words. So I know there's maybe a little bit of confusion about whether you can work for a South Dakota organization and meet the statute, when in fact, by my reading the language, that doesn't meet the requirements of the law. So to have it on its face, a requirement that a circulator post some or disclose certain information. Now, the first iteration of one of those bills I saw was really quite a laundry list of information, and I thought, was maybe at the other end of the extreme. And I'm assuming the bill has been amended to some degree, but I don't know that. I need to look at those bills, and I know there was, gosh, over 25 bills that impacted election law and campaign finance and circulation of petitions, just a ton of them. I think, like Dana, I think, had an article in the paper listing them all, maybe it was. In any case, those that have survived, I need to take a new look at them and read what their current form is. I'm not aware of anything that unduly alarms me at this stage, so I can't say I've identified any one that I intend to veto. But again, I haven't read the current form of any of them because so much has occurred so quickly while I was away.
Two food bill related questions. First, the bill designating Chislik as the state NOSH is on its way to you. Are you inclined to sign that one?
I really am disappointed that bill was brought, and I think it's a distraction and a silly piece of legislation. And but if the majority of both bodies passed it, I'll probably sign it. But it's not something I'd waste my time on as a legislator.
And then second, Senate Bill 169 was hog-housed on the Senate floor. Now it would allow bakers that infuse a small amount of alcohol to continue to do that legally. Would you sign that bill if it made its way?
Yes. I read the story about that in the Argus Leader. It's a fine publication with which you may be familiar. And so I saw what was going on there, and yeah, I think that bill's fine. I'll sign that.
What else are you watching next week as the legislative session comes to a close?
Well, I must say the legislature has worked very hard this last week to get a lot of work done. I know some committees have gone into extra sessions. I know some of them did that last week and the week before to try and get their work done. They were attentive to the fact that there was a heavy bill load this year and have worked hard. So I think many of the contentious issues have been either resolved and amended to the satisfaction of the parties involved, or they've died. And so I think the largest issue really that remains is the budget. And because happily there's additional revenue, there'll be a lot of discussions about where to spend that. I'm sure there'll be more ideas for spending than there are dollars to cover, but that's the nature of the budget making process. So I'm looking forward to the legislature narrowing down those choices, and then at some point we'll probably sit down. I generally sit down with the leadership and the appropriators to see where we can all agree and then put the appropriations bill to rest. I'm very proud that South Dakota has a very responsible process, and the legislature and the administration year after year gets a budget that's pretty responsible, signed several months before the year begins. There were about a dozen states that had no budget when this year we're in right now began. And I know Oklahoma just got their budget put to bed a couple of weeks ago. And as I mentioned earlier, when I was out on the way to the christening of the USS South Dakota last October, Pennsylvania was still fighting over their budget. And that's just not a good way to run a railroad. So I really appreciate the legislature working with the administration, not just while I've been governor, but in years prior to that, finding common ground, getting a budget put to bed before we all go home.
I think if I'm understanding it correctly, you have a bill on the way to you that would remove the sunset clause on the $900 bill. Are you going to sign it? Is it one of those instances where you propose something and actually come out ahead kind of?
Well, I think there could be two ways to look at that. I think some have made the argument, well, removing the sunset clause acknowledges that every year the legislature can revisit any policy that it chooses to, and that's true. The urgency of that is certainly driven when there's a sunset clause, and I think that was the notion of those who voted for the compromise that set a sunset clause that occurs later this year, and it forced the legislature to re-examine, re-debate. But I think also in the course of that, there was a fair recognition that it's still relatively early. We've only had a part of a season of hunting and fishing go by since the compromise was adopted and signed into law. And so certainly a couple more years would be good. That was the proposal I made. Without a sunset clause, there still will be an opportunity at every single legislative session to revisit the policy that formed the compromise and to tweak it, correct it, or reverse it if it turns out that it's not working to the satisfaction of most. So I'm perfectly happy with a 3-year sunset extension or with no sunset. Either way, I think it gives the current compromise, which I think was a very good striking of the balance. That's why it got the votes. That's why it kept the votes this time around. And it gives that a chance to work. And then if it doesn't work or some aspect needs to be changed, that can happen next year, or 2 years, or 3 years, or 10 years from now.
Legislators are going to start considering summer study topics. Is there anything that you would offer up to them as an idea, something they might look into?
Good question. I think there's been in the last couple of years increasing concern from the nursing home community and the community sport provider community that their funding is inadequate. We've done in the last year quite a bit of study of their funding streams and their cost records and cost reports, and so the administration, and there may have been some legislators involved, I don't recall. We've produced a report that helps identify those providers, I'll name one, home health care providers, who are not being reimbursed at as high a rate as some other providers. And I think it would be good for the legislature to be involved in a study of those costs, and I know they're interested in that, so I would encourage them to consider that. I think it's a mutual interest. And I wish you would ask me that question. I had thought to myself about a good summer study, but now I'm blanking on it. Sorry, if I think of it, I'll let you know.
This is random from a different colleague in another state. I think they called hoghousing gotten ago or something. And I was just curious if you knew where the term hoghouse came from.
Yes, it came from a bill long ago that displaced one measure with a measure to build a hog house at SDSU, or the reverse, remove a hog house. Yeah, I'm pretty certain that was it. There was a bill that appropriated some money for something, and it got completely removed and replaced with a bill to build a hog house. And so the notion of completely displacing the substance or the language of a bill with something completely different but still relating to the same title, then that's considered a hog house. So you've got to have the title remain the same to be true to the Constitution, but that's where the term came from.
Governor, this may be our last legislative press conference with you. I'm just wondering if there's any sense of nostalgia, anything that you're looking back on, or anything as you are thinking about next January when you're not in this room that you're looking forward to doing.
Well, I have enjoyed, I must say, I want to thank the members of the press with whom I've interacted. I think the press has been pretty fair to me. I don't think we've developed any enmity, and I know that occurs in some other places and with some other people. but I must say, I think you've always treated me fairly. I don't think you've given me undue accommodation. I think you asked some challenging questions too, and that's fair. That's fair. I'm happy to have a challenging question. It was interesting when I was at the National Governors Association. There's a group that supports folks who have disabilities, and they knew that I had an initiative to encourage employment of people who have disabilities. And this group had called ahead and said to the scheduler, can we schedule some time to interview the governor while he's at NGA in between one of the sessions, or if we catch him in the hallway? Sure. And of course, I'm happy to talk about that topic. And so I was leaving one of the NGA sessions, and a woman, I didn't recognize her, came forward, and she identified her organization as this disability, Citizens with Disability organization. Sure, yeah, I remember. I agreed to talk to you. So I started holding forth. Well, when the rest of the press that was there saw someone holding a recorder to a governor's mouth, it was like a swarm of bees. I could not believe it. It was like 10 or 12 came, and they all had their recorders, and then suddenly the questions were coming fast and furious on all kinds of topics. And I didn't have the time really to give them, and I didn't run from it. I answered 3 or 4 questions, and then I just said, hey, look, I've got to go. I've got another session I want to go to, and why they wanted to hear from a guy that's term limited from a state as small as South Dakota, and these were national reporters, is beyond me. But I think it's just the nature of writing today. You've only got so much time to gather facts, and then you try to get some opinions from people on different sides of that question that might be an informed opinion. And so I guess they might have thought I had some informed opinion, and I know the latter part is true, but whether it was informed or not, I don't know. So you have to ask them. But I have enjoyed our interaction, and I'll miss engaging on these things, because it's always a very interesting time during the session. There's always issues that range from the more mundane to the more complex and far-reaching, and like everyone, I have opinions on those things, and you give me the chance to express them and convey them to others. So I thank you for that.
Who are you going to vote for in the primary?
Oh, I'm not saying. I don't know that I even decided yet. Yeah. Well, I'm going to vote for Dusty Johnson. I've endorsed him on the Congress side.
You're going to write him in for governor?
No, I'm going to write Linda in for governor. No. All right, well, thank you all.